we've studied the book of Judges. So that's always good to be able to know what everybody else says. And like I always say, they normally take my material, but they really don't take my material. It's not my material. It's the Bible. So we're starting in Judges 20 and 21. We're going to finish up the last two chapters in the book of Judges. And all along here for the past month, I'd had how I was going to start this out. And that changed about 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. And so I thought, that don't sound like a good way to start. And I've got the Devo coming up on the 10th of September on Wednesday night. And I thought, that's probably more fitting for a Devo, how I would start it out. So we're not starting it out the same as I was going to originally. I'm just going to start out in chapter 20. Last week, Dennis did 3 chapters. And at the tail end of chapter 19, he talked about a subject. Me and Michael was walking down last Sunday night when we was talking about it, and I said, I'm looking forward to hearing Dennis's when it's available on our YouTube. I want to call it channel, but it's not channel, but whatever it is, whatever on YouTube, to see what he had to say, because 20 and 21 finish up what chapter 19 had started. And like Michael said, it's a pretty dark subject. But when we look around the world around us today, there's a lot of dark things happening, but there's also a lot of good things happening. We have to take the good with the bad, and that's what's happening here. And I always approach these studies like this is what does it mean for me today? Because when we look at the Old Testament, there's a lot of people say, it's the Old Testament, it means absolutely nothing to me today. And that's far from the truth. We can always find something to be relative to us today. I'm not going to read verse by verse, because how my mind thinks was I added those 2 chapters up and I divided it by 45, which is 45 minutes. So if I took 36.9 something seconds to read each verse, I could say it says what it says and means what it means and set back down. And that probably would be okay with some of you, but that's probably not the best way of doing it. So I'm going to read some of the verses today. Some of them you're going to have to bear with me. I'm going to kind of hit the highlights of it so we can get through both chapters today. And if we get through both chapters today and it's early, I still got more material. So I like to have more than I think I'm going to need. So we find here the Levite has been with his concubine, went and grabbed his concubine from her family. And we know what happened from what Dennis finished up last week. She was basically murdered, is what we would say, raped and murdered. Some people don't like hearing those words, but that's what happened. But anyhow, we find our situation here. He goes back to wherever he dwells at, and he cuts the concubine up. And this is what Dennis mentioned this last week, and I thought about it when I first started looking at this. I always thought concubine, I've always heard that it was another name for prostitute, is what I'd heard. But when you read into it and study it, concubine is a form of a wife, like Dennis said last week, but not a full-fledged wife, that you would say. And that was something that went on back then. It doesn't go on today. But anyhow, he took his concubine and divided her up into 12 pieces and sent it throughout the tribes of Israel. Why 12 pieces? 12 tribes, right? What tribe, what territory was the Levite in? Do you guys remember from last week? Benjamin, correct, Jim. It was in the tribe of Benjamin. I remember hearing Todd say he needs to stay in there, but I'm not a stand-still person. I'm going to try to stay between them two things, so I'm probably going out of the camera. So if someone watches this later on, they're going to think, where'd he go? But anyhow, I'm not a stand-still person. My wife will testify to that. But anyhow, so if he divided up in 12 pieces, that means one of those pieces would have went to the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? So that's where we find ourselves at today. The first 11 verses here, I'm not going to read those. But anyhow, Israel, they go out. That should be a surprise to them. That's not a gift to use the word gift. That's something you don't expect to receive. is a body part. I have never received a body part. Hope I never do. But that should be a shock to your system. It would have been to the nation of Israel too. All those tribes. Why is this person sending this to me? I want to know. So this is what caused the nation of Israel. They gathered at Mizpah, as 400,000 of them gathered there. And they would have, with that being in 12 parts of Benjamin, would have been privy to this information because he sent out 12. Therefore, they would have known. They would have probably questioned, at least I would hope they would have questioned, why is someone sending me a piece of a human being? That should cause us to look into situations when someone gives us information. We should look into it. And this is what the nation of Israel does. And we'll get into a little bit later on how maybe they could have done it differently or whatever. But anyhow, it says here they go to Mizpah, and if my thumb width is as my judge is my distance on looking on maps, it's roughly 6 to 7 miles above Gibeah is where this took place. And so Gibeah is a city inside the Benjamin territory, and they decide to get together in that territory and discuss what they were going to do with this, what the Levite had done and got their attention doing. But anyhow, just like anything else, in these first verses, the thing that struck my mind, and Dennis kind of alluded to this a little bit last week, it says in verse 5, they're asking the Levite, what exactly happened? That's a good question, right? Someone sends you something. Trace got a box from Amazon this week. We didn't order anything from Amazon. And we're like, and I said, it's got your name on it, Trace, so you must have ordered it. It was from her cousin for a late birthday from back in June. But anyhow, it made us wonder. The first thing I did was log on to Amazon and say, you didn't order anything. And come to find out it was from one of her cousins. But here they asked the Levite, what exactly happened? And he gives this story in verse 5. And I want to read verse 5. It says, and the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. If we go back into chapter 19, does it say it was the leaders of Gibeah that were wanting to get in touch with this Levite? If you look at 19 verse 22, the first part of it, it says, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. Were they the leaders? I don't know. It doesn't say in 22, but doesn't it sound better saying, boy, they're in charge. They're the ones at fault. He might be embellishing the story a little bit, but that's not the only place he embellishes it. He also says there in verse 5, they meant to kill me. Is that what the men that knocked on the door that wanted to have him come out, what did they say? If you go back to verse 22, they wanted to do what? They didn't say they wanted to kill him. It started with a K. What did it say they wanted to do to that gentleman? They wanted to be with him. They wanted to know him, which, as Dennis explained last week, when they, in that situation, when they say they want to know him, it's a homosexual tendency. They actually want to have sexual relationship with that man. Levite doesn't stop there. And it says here in verse 5, it says, and they violated my concubine. How did they get a hold of his concubine? Anybody remember from last week? Yeah, forced her to go out to the men. So here he's trying to make himself out. The questions that the nation of Israel didn't ask is how did they get a hold of your concubine? How did you not put up a struggle? I'm outside that line there. I can tell that right now. But anyhow, why do they take him, just this person? What are we supposed to do when someone gives us information and it's really negative information? Should we rush off to do something about it? Or are we supposed to step back and take that information? How many witnesses does it tell us? in the New Testament? Was that? I heard someone say it. 2 or 3. 2 or 3. Why is that? Because it's apparent here the Levite gives them a partial truth. Did those men kill his concubine? Absolutely. They didn't mean to kill him, but he's probably saying, well, if they killed her, they would have killed me. So he's not, but we don't know that because that's not what happened. And the sad thing about it is you just kind of wonder, did that guy sleep that night? These are the questions I have. We don't have the answers to it, but I don't understand how you could do that, look at a fellow human being and throw them off to the side like that and still sleep at night. Whether he did or not, I don't know. It doesn't say. But that's the first 11 verses. So we've got 400,000 of the other 11 tribes have gathered here. And they want answers. They want to know what is going on. They want to get to the bottom of it because no matter, we've studied the book of Judges, and it's valid that, yes, the nation of Israel would follow God for a while and then things would be good and then they'd go away. But in that saying, are we any different today than they was back then as a general group? We look here, we see this nation is called, I've heard the Christian Judeo principles. And there is some truth in that, but just like the Levite, is that the total truth? Because you look at when this country was founded, look at all the things that we see that this country was founded on that was going on at the time. People were looked down upon. Slavery still existed when this country was founded. We know that is against what God desires for how mankind to treat each other. We see this, so we have to be careful when we say we want to get back to that, because you don't want to get back to all that. You want to get to what the good part is. But anyhow, we've got 400,000 people. That's a pretty good sum. But then we go to 12 through 18. I'm not going to read it. And it says that they did, to me, a smart thing. It would be a good thing to do. Just like I said, when you get negative information, you want to get to the bottom of what the answers would be. And so they go send people out to the tribe, Benjamin, all over the tribe, and say, what does this mean? And basically paraphrasing this, they basically said, mind your own business. Go on your way. We'll take care of our own. People today would say, why are you meddling in my business? And this is how they looked at it. It says here that Benjamin gathered up 26,000, if you do the math, 26,700 people in their tribe. 400,000 on one side, 26,700 on the other side. What side, if you were going to go into battle, would you want to pick? I would want the 400,000, right? Yeah. Roughly 14, 15 to 1, the numbers don't add up. But anyhow, we're going to do a civil war. You say, how can a civil war happen? I mentioned our country was founded on this, less than 80. If you do the math, I think it's 80. I always want to think 7 years ago, but it would be 2 years minus that. But anyhow, you think 85 years after we were founded, our country went into civil war for some of those things that I just brought up, because people started realizing, hey, this is wrong, and they started voicing their concern for it. Israel knows what happened, and Benjamin was wrong. But anyhow, we get to this point. They've already formed up. They've gathered close by so they could pretty much attack at that point. And now they ask in verse 18, it says, the people of Israel arose, went up to Bethel, and inquired of God, who shall go up first for us to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Why Judah? Anybody have an idea why Judah would have went up first? Do what? Oldest, or I think Reuben was the oldest, right? Reuben would be your oldest as far as that. If you go back to chapter 1, Judah went up first there. But anyhow, it's kind of weird when you think about the tribe of Judah. Where did Christ, he come from the tribe of Judah? If you look at the tribe of Benjamin, Saul come from there, the first king, some of the smallest one, and this hasn't happened yet, so this is what's leading up to it. But anyhow, it says Judah will go up first. I don't have a good reason. It could be anything, it doesn't tell us, but that's how my mind works. I always like these questions. Okay, so Judah's going to go up first. We're down to verse 19. I'm going to read 19 through 23. It says, Then the people of Israel rose in the morning and camped against Gibeah, and the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin. And the men of Israel drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. The people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 men of Israelites. But the men of Israel, took courage and again formed the battle line in the same place where they had formed it on the first day. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until the evening. And they inquired of the Lord, Shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Go up against them. They inquire God, who should go up first? All right? He said, send Judah up first. 22,000 people died that day. It doesn't mention anybody from the Benjaminites, if any of them got killed. So we can infer that 22,000 out of the 400 are dead now. Benjamin apparently didn't lose anybody when we think about that. That's quite a bit of things to think about. Let's read 24 through 28, and then I'll make some other comments on that. It said, So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day. And Benjamin went against them out of Gibeah the second day and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword. Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, Shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So we find out it's interesting to read these, and if you just read this and you don't read commentaries and stuff like that, it's always interesting to me when you read different commentaries of the issues surrounding the first day of battle, the second day of battle. I read different ones, and some will say it's consecutive days, and some will say, well, you can't take it for that. I guarantee you, the kids that have been in the high school class upstairs will say, we're getting into the weeds there, you might as well say. We're getting into the roots, not just the weeds, but sometimes it doesn't really much matter on that. All we need to realize is there's two separate battles. One, they lost 22,000. One, they lost 18,000. Now, it's not Marietta math, as I tell my wife. This is frontier math. That would be 40,000 people out of 400,000 have died in 2 days of battle. Like I said, if you look at it from the start, 400,000 against 26,000. I know what side I would want to be on, speaking strictly from a number point. But once again, we don't know the whole situation. Why would they lose those two battles? Anybody have any ideas? I wrote down a couple. The first thing I looked at is they got these pieces of this concubine sent to them. They didn't ask for them, they were sent to them. And just the shock of it, I don't know if it was wrapped or how it was transported to them or however, it doesn't tell us that. All we know it was there. But once you would have realized what was sent to you, the shock you would have had from that would instantly, the question would be why. And they had to have known where this came from. There had to have been some sort of message, or why else would they went to the land of Benjamin to begin with? They thought they were being good by approaching the tribe and saying, hey, what's this? You send the worthless fellows to us. We need to take care of this. We need to purge this. What's one thing that's missing there from the first time that we read that they actually inquire of God's when? Who goes up first? Right? What's one question they forget to ask? Do we need to go up, right? What do we need to do? Now, with that being said, today we can't say, hey, and God will respond back to us in voice. But when we see issues today, there's a couple things that we can do. First and foremost, we can certainly pray about it. And this past week, I found out that prayer's not good. I would have to disagree with them. There's people in the news that say prayer means nothing. It's because they don't know the power of prayer. But if we want to know what God wants for us today, we have to read God's Word, right? We find here in the book of Judges why I mentioned earlier in class that some people say it's the Old Testament, it really don't mean nothing to us today. Why can't we learn from this? We hear someone tell us something. It doesn't have to involve the congregation here or anything like that. But you hear something at work or out in a civic group or something like that. And did you hear what so-and-so did? And it's something you hear that's so terrible that you instantly think, boy, we got to do something about this. And then later on you might find out that it may not be true. Now we know here in this situation, yes, did those people in Gibeah kill that concubine? Yes, we do know that. But Israelite might have been more into a frenzy. They might have inquired of God if the Levite hadn't have told him his half-truth. We don't know that. The other thing is those 400,000 against that 26,000. When I mentioned Civil War earlier on, what does that mean, Civil War-wise? Brothers and sisters, right, blood relatives. They were extremely close blood relatives. We're all blood relatives if you go back far enough, but they were extremely close because they come from Jacob. They would have been extremely close. Sometimes we let pride get in our way because when we read something in the Bible, or we don't even necessarily read it, but we read it with something already. Our mind's made up. Have you ever done that about anything in your life? My mind's made up about this, and I'm going to prove that this is how it is. And then you get more and more information, and you approach God's Word with an open mind, because since you was a little kid, this is all you've ever heard, that this is wrong, and then all of a sudden, through your self-studying stuff, you're like, you know what? I really need to think this thing through. But the human nature of us is like I said, I use Trace a lot, but she can tell you I'm stubborn on some stuff. And that's something that I need to work on. But also, if it is the truth, we do need to stick to our guns. That's the other thing. But make sure that the truth that you're sticking to is actually the truth, not what you've been told for years, and things like that. I see Brent back there, he's got his West Virginia shirt on there. Now see, at work, because I work in West Virginia, and I'm a Buckeye, I always tell them, they'll always complain about Ohio State. And my response to that is jealousy is a powerful thing. And finally one of them said, you know what, you're probably right there. But jokingly I say that. But when we look at it is I have to take what their thoughts are. And I've been to Ohio State games before. And to be quite honest with you, there are some arrogant people, we're number one and stuff like that. That's okay in that arena. But as far as the function of the church, the function of this congregation here is arrogance has no place in it. The nation of Israel thought that they were doing the right thing, in all honesty, and sometimes we catch ourselves into that. Sometimes that pride catches up with them. They didn't ask God, are we supposed to go up against them? They just want to know who to send first. Finally, they learned the lesson here. It's in verse 28, it says, at the tail end of it says, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people, or shall we cease? Maybe those first 2 times they thought, I've got the numbers, we're going to whip them, no problem at all. And they thought, we've got God on our side because why? They just took God for granted. Why do we think God would be on their side? Because sometimes they put him on the back burner, as we say. 29 through the end of the chapter there, we have the final day of battle. And of course, we know the tribe of Benjamin is defeated in that because God says, I will give them into your hand. They asked the right question. Sometimes when we say our prayer, you have to watch. Sometimes, and the younger we are, sometimes we allude to, hey, am I going to get this? And say, hey, appreciate the blessings that you've given me and things like that. We have to approach it in the right way. They approached it in the right way and said, hey, should we go up against them or should we cease? But here we find that Israel sets up an ambush. They're smart about it. They're going to draw them out of the city, and there's going to be partial men sitting out there. And from my understanding, there was pretty much one way in, one way out of how it sat on the hillside. And so anyhow, maybe that pride took over the tribe of Benjamin. They said, you know what? We've whipped them the first 2 days, right? We're definitely going to whip them again, right? Maybe the pride switched sides. Israel humbled themselves and said, hey, do you really want us to do this or what? And God says, yes, I want you to do it. Tomorrow I will give them to you. Benjamin doesn't, we don't see on the Benjaminites, if they inquire of God, should we go ahead and leave the fortified city? We've whipped them twice, we may not whip them a third time, but maybe their pride of life come in to effect. They start chasing away because we're going to win. We won the first 2 times. We're going to win the third time, right? Third time's a charm. Well, we find out differently. They started chasing off. That was the plan. Part of the men would start running off because, hey, that's going to draw them out. It works. They send up smoke to signify that they've conquered the city, the ones that laid an ambush once the battle started and drew most of the fighting men away. There was no one there to protect the city. The city fell. The cloud of smoke signaled to the other Israelites on the other side, hey, the city's taken, let's turn, and we're going to attack. God's told them, I will give them into your hand. We cannot forget that. They know they're going to win. Once again, if we're on God's side, in the end, we're going to win. That's what we can take from that. If God says this is how he wants us to live, and if you live this way and you're faithful to that, in the end, you're going to win. That's always a good feeling. I just wonder on that third day of battle of how much taller those fighting men stood because they were told, I will help you defeat them the next day. They finally, like I said, asked the correct questions. Just me, because for some odd reason math has always been one of my favorite subjects along with history. I was adding the numbers up, and we have to realize that the numbers, if you read it, a lot of these numbers are rounded and stuff. But the one thing, verse 47, it says, talks about all the men that fell that day, but it said there were 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. It says in 48, and the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men, and beast, and all that they found, and all the towns that they found, they set on fire. So other than these 600 people that somehow escaped, there was not anybody left in that tribe. Their own blood could have been responsible for wiping them out. Why would they wipe them out since there were 600 men left? If there is just one, and there is 2 genders, by the way, if there's one gender, and I've heard this argument before, if you take all males or all females and stick just one on an island, how many generations is that people on that island going to last? Anybody? How many generations? One, right. Like Jim put his finger up. One generation. It is not going to survive. We're down to 600 men. That's pretty much a death sentence to look at it that way. That's where the Israelites have taken their fellow kinsmen, their close blood, and things like that. So we find ourselves in chapter 21. Anybody have anything on 20 they want to add? All righty. Let me get a quick drink of water here. You'd think someone who's used to talking a lot would never get thirsty, but the temperature's different from up here than it is back here when I normally sit. Okay, 21. First 3 verses, I want to read those. It says, Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? They've come to realize what they've put one of their fellow kinsmen in, that if they don't do something about this, they're going to die off. There'll be one tribe. There'll only be 11 tribes left. Now, they've done a thing that says, Cursed be the man that gives any of their females to the leftover men in the tribe, because apparently they was probably going to plan on wiping them all out anyhow. But anyhow, they weren't counting on the 600 to escape. Where else in this book of Judges do we find someone that puts something out there really quick like and doesn't realize what that truly means? Remember the name? I can say Bill taught about it, and that means 2 different people. You guys remember that name? Starts with a J, and it's not Jesus. I'll give you that. Jephthah. Jephthah made the vow, and his vow was what? First thing that came out of that door, right? And what was the first thing that came out of that door? His daughter. You know, if you go back and you don't remember the explanation on that, go back and watch Bill and Bill. And I mean Bill McFarland, Bill Deem, they were the ones that taught about it. That's why I mentioned the name Bill, I mean 2 different people. They taught on this, okay? And you can go back and see they made that vow. Apparently they didn't learn the lesson here because they made another, Cursed be the man that gives a daughter. Now, if they're not supposed to marry outside the nation of Israel and everyone said, Cursed be the person that's not, you've kind of dug yourself into or painted yourself into a corner, right? And this is exactly what they've done. And without thinking things through, just like jumping into the battle real quick, because they knew that's what had to be done, because that's what you had to do, without asking God if that's what he wanted done in the first place. They jumped into it. Verses 4 through 12, they're coming up with a plan. And the one thing that they do ask, it says here, was, did anybody not come up? They wanted everybody to come up to fight this battle because they wanted to show strength, right? The bigger the number, the better off they was. And they find out here, it says here in verse 9, in 4 through 12, it says, For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. If you go back to verse, I think it's verse 1. Yeah, verse 1 in chapter 20, it says here, Then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. Reading that the first time through, it never really caught my eye, but the more you look into it, and then it says, someone didn't come from Jabesh Gilead. If that's how you say it, that's close enough for me. But anyhow, why did it mention in chapter 20, verse 1, all that territory, there was people sent, but there was this one city in that territory no one came from. And once again, like I mentioned, reading different commentaries, and the one commentary, which is pretty popular in the church, they said what's caused they were fellow kinsmen. And that caught me off guard. I thought, what do you mean they're fellow kinsmen? I'm thinking all of them was, right? Am I We've established that, right? Just like I say, when we say something, I'm sure this person, this commentator in their mind knew what they were writing down, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this is from further study on this. I'm thinking, why would you come up with that? Gilead was in the tribal territory of Manasseh. Does that mean anything to you? You got Benjamin and Manasseh. Where was the tribe of Manasseh from? Anybody know? What's that, Lord? I can't read lips very well. You had 2 tribes out of the 12 tribes, right? Levite was actually Jacob's son. You had 2 other tribes. The light bulb went off when I looked up on the map, because I like to know where things are at. It was in the tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh, were they, whose was their true earthly father? Joseph, right. Okay. Who was Joseph's parents? Jacob and, starts with an R, Rachel. When I was going this over in my head yesterday, I kept thinking Rebecca, and I'm like, that just don't sound right. Why do I keep saying, well, you get stuff on there. So I went back. So you have Jacob, and I'm going to say Rebecca again, Rachel. Who else was Jacob and Rachel's son? Benjamin. Okay, so Manasseh from Joseph, they'd have been a little bit close relative. They were actually from both mom and dad, right? To us as human beings, that would make them a little bit closer, but if we know back that we go back far enough, we are all from one thing. And if I look over here at Jeremiah Carter, how many races are there? 1. What race is that? Human race. Correct, Jeremiah. Human race. That was one of the studies this past quarter in all the classes. So anyhow, I'm sure that's what they meant is that lineage, that they were from Jacob and Rachel, and that's where that comes from. So anyhow, they find out they did not come from this one city. Whether that's valid or not, we don't know. But for some odd reason, no one come from that city. So guess what they're going to do? They're going to destroy that city minus any, we would call it a virgin today. It was anybody that hadn't been with a man, they were going to do it. Well, they had 400 women after that was all said and done. You got 600 on this side, 400 on this side. Everything's good, right? Until what? Who's going to be the 400 to get one and the 200 don't? Who decides that? Well, we can't do that, So they've really painted themselves in the corner. Now they're up on their tiptoes. We've got to come up with another 200 people. And that's where we find out here that once they've done that, they offer peace to Benjamin. They come out and they've got the 400 and they say, hey, we're still 200 short roughly. What are we going to do? And I heard that first bell. 16 through 24, we read where they come up with this thing, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I wasn't going to read that, but anyhow, since I don't think time, I'll read it real quick. 16 through 24, it says, Then the elders of the congregation said, What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin? And they said, There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the people of Israel had sworn. Cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, Behold, there is a yearly feast of the word of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanon. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, Grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. When they go into battle to begin with, they don't ask God, is this what you really want us to do? They didn't ask. Today, when we face our questions in our minds, we go to God's Word. They had the opportunity to actually go to God, and they chose not to. Do you notice in chapter 21, they knew they'd done messed up. They'd done lost the first two battles. They probably should have asked what God wanted them to do, and they still didn't. So they've put themselves in this spot, and they basically go from killing people to this tribe of Benjamin to turning them into what? Common criminals, right? They told him to lie in ambush. And I wrote down here that you could either call it kidnapped, taken, or stolen. But those people, because they'd taken that oath, they went out on the limb and taken that oath real quick, not thinking it through. If they would have given those other 200 people, they'd have been cursing themselves. And they felt that was more important than living up to that than asking God what he wanted to do. For us today, we should approach God. And how we can do that is, like I said, through prayer and also by studying his word. And we just can't study a single verse and say, yep, that's the answer. Why do we have to continue to study? Is because each time I read this through, I would pick up something different. I couldn't tell you how many times I read it through, but each time I could come up with a totally different lesson than I did this morning by going a different route. We can do that. That's not to say God's word's confusing. It's just that when we see A, B, and C together, sometimes we go to D. Someone new to the faith, I would hope no one here would say, hey, read the book of Revelations. That'll give you all the answers. We certainly wouldn't want to confuse anybody there. We would certainly want to start them out to make them successful. To me, one of the most important verses in that whole thing there, and this sounds great, says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Do we see that in the world today? Unfortunately, we do. When we take God out of our lives, and no one else, I hear people say, well, they've taken him out of here, here, and here. No one can take God out of our lives. Only we ourselves can take God out of our lives. Certainly, yes. Can they make certain laws that would create trouble with us meeting here? Yes, they could do that. But guess what? We would have a choice in not doing that. Now, that's not saying that we need to be civilly disobedient. Yes, we're as long as it doesn't cost us our souls in the end, we can make do. But we certainly cannot, if they just say, hey, don't worship God, don't be faithful to what the New Testament teaches us, then certainly we have to stand up for that. Anybody have any questions, comments? I heard the second bell there before we get dismissed. I didn't get to my extra stuff, so I guess that's your guys' fortune. I'd have bored you some more then. So. All right, well, we'll get ready for worship hour, and thank you for your attention.